Thank you for clinking the glasses. I hope that you're all very well fed, both gastronomically and intellectually. Yesterday we talked a good deal about the role of the public sector when it comes to affecting social change and when it comes to the evolving social contract. And this morning we've been talking about a large ways in the private sector, including the private sector side of all of us. And now we're going to look at the ways in which the public, private, and philanthropic sectors interact to advance the social good. We're going to start off with remarks from Elizabeth Littlefield, and then be joined by a distinguished panel of 3 other guests. Elizabeth is the 10th president of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, which is the financing arm of the U.S. government. And before that, she ran an organization that we all called CGAP, but it's the consultative group to assist the poor. Prior to that, which is a think tank and looks at questions of how to provide development finance, how to provide financial services to the poor. She was at the World Bank, where she was the director of the financial and private sector, and prior to that she was an investment banker. She was at JP Morgan Chase, and she was a managing partner there in charge of capital markets and finance in the New Europe, the East and Central Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Littlefield.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much, Jane. Really, when I look around the room, I think, you must be so proud of what you've put together in the last X number of years. I think we could have a round of applause for Jane. It is really inspiring to be in a room with so much commitment, so much good energy, so much creativity, all packed in one room and all focused on making the world a better place. So it's a privilege to be here. As the U.S. government's development finance institution, OPIC is actually, living proof that that private investment for the public good can work and does work. In fact, OPIC has been investing billions of dollars every single year since its inception to accompany private investors who are investing in development in emerging markets. And we've been doing that every year in a self-sustaining way so that we can actually give money back to the taxpayer every single year. In this city, in this time, you can't say that enough. We're actually a solution to the deficit, not a drain on it. So if you think about it, and this is why this is a very important part of the conversation that we're having today about private and public sectors working together, every single solitary dollar that we catalyze from the private sector to invest in development, whether it be in health clinics in Peru or microfinance in Uganda or biofuels in Liberia, every single one of those dollars that we catalyze from the private sector is one more dollar that does not need to be spent by the public sector or philanthropists and that can be shifted towards other priorities or back to the taxpayer. Now, stepping back, history is filled with predictions that have been wildly off the mark. But there are some trends that are so powerful that you can see the chart, you can chart the course of their trajectory even 30 or 40 years out. And so what do we know? We know, for example, right now that a child that is born today, before they reach the age of 18, our planet will be home to more than 8 billion people. We know that before that child is 18, our global biosphere will have experienced pressure that it has never experienced before in the history of mankind. We know that by the time that child is 18, 3 billion more people, give or take a few million, will have moved into the middle class where they'll be pursuing occupations and consuming goods that are far more energy intensive than any generation in the history of humanity. Global energy consumption will by then be 30 to 40% higher than it is today, and agricultural production will need to double if we're to feed the Earth's population by then. And we know that all of that energy that's going to be supplied to the world, sadly, still about 75% of it will still come from hydrocarbons, which are well on their way, as we all know, to making climate change irreversible. So trying to get our heads our collective heads around the implications of these megatrends, the first question one asks is, well, how are we going to organize ourselves to deal with the challenges that these megatrends present? Who is going to do the work, the real work, for the massive adaptations that are needed? Well, as Jane often remarks, and did so in her great Forbes interview, governments certainly can't do it alone, or frankly, they can't even lead it. And neither the developed country nor developing country budgets are anywhere near sufficient, and frankly, they're all completely hampered by the limited time horizons of politics. Nor, with all due respect, can NGOs and philanthropists and international organizations do it on their own. They have their own limitations. So clearly we need the private sector to shoulder most of the work. The private sector, that vast, decentralized, rough and tumble $60 trillion network of corporations and firms and enterprises and small businesses that already supports livelihoods and lives around the world. It's the largest lever we have, the private sector. And you know what? It's already happening. When OPIC was carved out of AID some 40 years ago because it was recognized that the private sector needed its own dedicated agency to focus on it, at that time, the money flowing from the US to emerging markets was 75% overseas development assistance, and the rest was foreign direct investment. Today, 40 years later, that's completely flipped around, and 80% of the money flowing from the US to emerging markets is foreign direct investment, and the rest of it is ODA. So now, every single solitary year, more than $1 trillion in private capital is flowing, both strategic investments from corporations as well as portfolio investment from investors, flowing into the poorer nations of the world. And actually, if the financial crisis taught us anything, it taught us that fundamentals were a hell of a lot worse in the developed world than we ever thought, and they were a hell of a lot better in the developing world than we ever thought. And so now, emerging markets is considered a core fundamental part of any asset allocation or any portfolio of investments. It's no longer considered an exotic. And this matters a lot. This matters a lot because, imagine this, just a 1% shift in global asset allocation from the developed world to the developing world equals $2 trillion additional dollars for development. Now, that's not only an astounding figure in absolute terms, it's an astounding figure in relative terms because it's 10 times the amount of money that the entire planet spends on development assistance already. So 1% shift in money from developed to developing countries is 10 times the amount of assistance that all the rich countries, all the developed nations give to developing nations every year. And of course, for the countries that are receiving these funds, it's not just new money, that's important, but it's also new money tied to newer and more efficient and more innovative generations of technology and infrastructure and services, enabling them to leapfrog. We all know about mobile banking systems in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and enabling that country to skip over legacy systems like check cashing that we suffer from here in the US. Now, we all nod enthusiastically when we hear the word private sector and getting the private sector involved, and public-private partnerships, and everyone gets enthusiastic about it. But frankly, I get the sense that we all mean completely different things when we talk about this, and we have even less of a convergence around what it looks like to implement a public-private partnership. And it's a culture issue. It's clearly there's two different cultures colliding in this. So if we're going to harness the private sector to deal with global sustainability, I think we need to first honestly acknowledge two intrinsic features of private firms and how they behave in the market. Now, I say features and not problems of the private sector and firms intentionally because, of course, I firmly believe that a well-regulated market system is our best hope for a sustainable global economy. I don't want to bury modern capitalism, I want to cultivate it. But so of these two features, the first feature is that businesses for thousands and thousands of years have focused on a very narrow definition of their resources, their production processes, and their pricing. They are not accustomed to factoring in the true diverse environmental costs that go into the production of their products. Take cars, for example. We all focus on tailpipe emissions, and it's, of course, a huge issue. But then The Guardian did an article, an analysis a month or so ago that just analyzed the carbon emissions generated from the manufacturing of that car, the mining of the metals, the harvesting of the rubber, the tanning of the leather for the seats. The total, they're equal. It takes as much carbon emissions to make a car as will be spent in the emissions coming from the tailpipe for the entire life of that car. So here we have one of the biggest industries in the entire world, and we're just beginning to understand the full impact of it on the global environment. So we got to be very clear about acknowledging this legacy and habit of unaccounted costs or externalities of private business. The second intrinsic feature of markets is that when it comes to the basic activities of capitalism, owning factors of production, adding value to them, and selling a product or service for a profit, investors will almost always skew towards short-term payoffs. Now, behavioral economists have a fancy term for this. They call it myopic loss aversion. That explains to you why they're economists and not branding specialists or communicators. But the basic idea is that even when we know intellectually that the prospect of a long-term investment payoff is very bright, we irrationally obsess over the prospect of short-term losses. We can't help it. We want quick paybacks, a bird in the hand. And this is one of the reasons why the efforts of firms and investors today on sustainability look so piecemeal. The sustainability reports are separate from the normal reports. They're kind of piecemeal and isolated. Firms will embark on sustainability initiatives only if they can immediately cut costs, reduce waste, limit risks, or gain market share among socially conscious customers. And frankly, I would only be investing in those short-term things if I were them too, if my incentive structure was set up just as theirs is. With stock markets being the bellwether or the indicator of a CEO's performance and quarterly financial results driving stock prices, the odds are absolutely stacked against long-term planning. So let me skip ahead. So frankly, if the financial crisis also showed us anything, this is the second learning from the financial crisis, it is the wisdom of aiming for reasonable, steady, long-term returns rather than the heady, quick buck ones. A friend of mine often says, any bank making more than 10% ROE makes me want to run in the opposite direction right now because something's funny with the bank making a 10% ROE. So how do we make sure that we are clear-eyed about the full cost of business, and how do we counteract the very powerful myopia, and how do we motivate and incentivize the private sector as a long-term endeavor? Well, I believe we are thankfully well past the notion of a necessary trade-off between sustainability and commercial success. And I also believe that we're in agreement that the ethos of sustainability will not succeed if it is seen as something that is imposed on firms in the market economy. But it has a chance of succeeding if it's understood as something that is essential to their operation. So, market-oriented solutions imposed on businesses, such as cap and trade or pricing of ecosystem services, or even sustainability reporting standards, are very important, but they're clearly not enough. What we need is an entire ecosystem of entrepreneurs and investors alike that aim for full-fledged environmental and social sustainability while recognizing and harnessing the unique attributes of the modern private firm. So it's not one solution, but it's a profusion of experiments, enthusiastic and excited experiments, partnerships, and business models being funded by a diversity of financial instruments tailored towards these models and blends of short and long-term revenue flows. Now, I actually am extremely optimistic. I'm very optimistic that with a greater understanding between the public and the private sectors, a clear-eyed clarity about what drives and motivates each one, and innovative and generous partnerships that leave egos aside and combine and align resources, we can absolutely harness the markets to solve many, many of the world's most daunting development challenges. In fact, this is what OPIC and its other peers in the other development finance institution peers do, for a living. It's funding the creation of endeavors that bring together the most innovative business models with the most urgent problems of sustainability in the nations that need the help the most. So consider for just 1 second the child that I mentioned at the opening of my comments here. By the time she's reached the age of 18, some $14 trillion will have been spent in new electrical capacity around the world. $14 trillion will have been spent on electrical capacity. Now, I'm optimistic because it is inconceivable to me that we would witness that much investment and not see a major disruptive technology, a major breakthrough, a major scientific invention, something that radically alters all of our plans and the potential. And we can already see pieces of that jigsaw puzzle coming together on the table. We have impact investors, we have B corporations, we have the public-private partnerships, we have patient capital, and we have all of you sitting here in this very room. In sum, I think we clearly can and should be using private capital as much as possible to solve development challenges. Every single private sector dollar we harness for long-term problem solving means that we're freeing up another public sector dollar for the most urgent problems. And I think it's our superb panel today who's going to be exploring some of these promising new solutions and some of these promising new ideas. I'd like to just close with something some of you may have heard me say before, but I'll say it again. President Obama often quotes Martin Luther King in saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. My dream for all of us here today in this room is that in that long arc of history, the big story of our time is not going to be that billions of people in China and Russia and India and across the world turned towards market economics in such a short period of time. That's not going to be the big story. The big story for me is that people within market economies, investors and entrepreneurs, figured out how to transform their capital and their know-how into answers for the common challenges that we all face, challenges of poverty, healthcare, water, housing, energy, climate change, and others. Thank you very much. And I'm here.
So I'm going to thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
So much. I'm going to introduce up the panel, but I'm going to start off. Is my mic going? Good. And then I'm going to start off with a question to Elizabeth and then move down the line. We're joined by Julie Katzman, who's COO of the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. Before that, she's been with the bank for a while. She used to run a major fund, which I'm going to ask her about, but she also comes out of an investment banking background as well. Jayant Sinha runs the Omidyar network in India, where he oversees all of their investments as well as their grants portfolio, but it is a mix of investments and grants. And Laila Iskandar from Egypt runs something called CID Consulting that she founded. And it works with all three sectors to find solutions to problems, including very community-based problems. And so she'll add some on-the-ground knowledge to this conversation. Elizabeth, I know why you do what you do, because this is your passion. But tell me why the U.S. government does it. I understand why it's in our interest to see sort of inclusive development happen around the world. And I understand why it's in our interest to help American businesses do business overseas. But give me a sense of when a government agency like OPIC is needed to ease the path for the private sector. Right. Is it when the risk is too great, or what are the conditions?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So we see our job as being helping to channel private sector capital to solve development challenges in emerging markets. And we do that, OPIC does that, by providing the loans, the finance, and the risk mitigation tools that remove the barriers to investing and provide incentives. So if we believe in a certain country, take Afghanistan, for example. This is a country, of course, it's incredibly important to this country and frankly all of us, that as we pull our troops out of Afghanistan, we leave behind some beginnings of a credible economy that can provide opportunities and support into the future as we shift from a military and aid-based economy to a private one. Now, many investors are not going to go and invest in Afghanistan just comme ça. It's probably not high on the list of places that look like attractive business environments. So we go out and try to figure out what is it we can do in terms of providing political risk insurance and providing long-term financing that could incite an investor to make an investment that we think will be powerful for that economy going forward.
Thanks so much. Julie, because you too are a public sector actor seeking to leverage and enable private sector investments, when you hear the title, All Private Means, what does private mean to you?
Well, I actually loved the title because I think it can mean so many things, and it goes back to Elizabeth's comment that we often use the same words to mean very different things. So I thought I'd give a couple of examples because I think it can mean all private means really private, a private company who does something that catalyzes social good and is largely in their own self-interest. Indra Nui was in Cartagena at the Summit of the Americas with us this weekend talking about, from Pepsi's perspective, the forward-looking concept that resources on the planet, much as you were describing the needing to double agricultural output if we're going to feed all the people on the planet when that child's 18, are a scarce resource. So for Pepsi, thinking about how to increase productivity of agricultural resources is extremely important from a business perspective. But it also has a developmental aspect for them. So we've done a project with Pepsi where Pepsi is giving sunflower seeds to farmers in Mexico where sunflower isn't really grown, and they have a big health issue in Mexico, huge obesity rates. They need to change to safflower oil for their snacks so that they're not seen as a bad actor. So gives out sunflower seeds and guarantee a purchase of 100% of the sunflowers for sunflower oil. And together with us, put in place a first loss guarantee so that a bank will provide working capital to those farmers. So really a private sector by all private means. Different example, which is in Colombia, there's a company called Public Company of Medellin, which is a utility. But it's a mixed company. It's a public utility, but it's listed. And it is looking at energy conservation and saying they have a need to lower demand and increase their efficiency. They also realize that by having utility bills with people who are at the bottom of the pyramid, they've got basically a credit bureau. So they could lend to their customers to purchase more energy efficient white goods, dryers, washers, etc., at much lower interest rates. So they're lending using that credit database basically at 17% interest versus 30% interest in the marketplace. At the same time, they're lowering energy demand. So, two very different solutions, and just to give a third, we are a big catalyst behind the development of venture capital markets in Latin America. And I'll use Brazil as an example. We've seeded 13 different venture funds in Brazil, 10 of which are already on Fund 2 or Fund 3. They've been very successful. $1 billion and 8 of the top 10 pension funds have come into those venture funds, so it's a lot of local money that's been catalyzed. And that's a way to grow small and growing businesses, create a knowledge economy, build a middle class, and it's a classic venture model. No ifs, ands, or buts. So by all private means can mean so many different things. And I think it's important when we talk about them to know kind of what it is we're talking about, what the motivations are, who's trying to achieve what, and also for us as a development finance institution to try to come up with ways to enable some of those new private actors to create these kinds of effects.
Yeah. I think it should be noted that IADB, or now it's called IDB more often now, started in 1959, isn't that right? So it's been in this business a very long time, focused on Latin America and the Caribbean, and OPIC has been in the business since 1969. So while we sometimes treat these efforts as novel ideas, they just happen to be fresh and relevant, but they're not utterly new. The first panel today, Tony Alumalu, Carol Chavitas, Lawrence Lean, described very different approaches to philanthropy, but what they had in common was this sense that every effort needed to be community-based. There needed to be sort of co-creations with the community and community feedback loops. How does the IDB go about that? And I'm thinking in particular about the opportunities for the majority fund. So maybe you could say something, or initiative, I should say. Could you say something about that?
Absolutely, and I know Luis Ross was here yesterday talking about Brazil, who runs opportunities for the majority. So I'll use another example to talk about this. I mean, the bank is a broad institution, and we do everything from very large loans for, hydro projects to things like what Opportunities for the Majority does, which is to focus on creating platforms for the base of the pyramid that can expand and scale quite dramatically. On the big side, there's an emphasis on the kinds of safeguards that relate to community, making sure that you've consulted properly. But on the more community-based base of the pyramid side of things, it's a different kind of initiative. So we have a program in Mexico called Improving Your Street. So everybody here who's traveled to the developing world knows that so many communities exist without services and without paved streets. And there's a huge amount of health information that has to do, forget the services, just the paving of the streets, change the quality of people's life and health outcomes. But local governments, as we've said, national governments, never mind, and then you get to local government, just don't get there. They don't have the resources, they don't have much of what it takes to make this happen. So this was an initiative working with communities to say, okay, if we can organize the community, and 80% of the community wants to basically kick in to pave the streets, Cemex, the large cement company, will provide the working capital. They're basically the bank. Over the course of 70 months, the community pays back $15 a month. They put up some money up front so that Cemex has acts sort of as a first loss guarantee, we're the second loss guarantee. The municipality participates, so they're committing to put in the infrastructure because then you pave the street. And that's the kind of community involvement that we see as really essential to so many development activities going forward.
And say something about the Multilateral Investment Fund. You ran that for a while.
Yes,
Give
I
us
did.
a sense of that.
So the Multilateral Investment Fund is the bank's grant-making arm, and we worked with Elizabeth's former organization quite substantially. It does two things. It makes grants on the one hand, and it does investments on the other. And its investments are in two areas, microfinance institutions and the venture capital business. On the grant side and on the investment side, it's focused on access to finance, access to basic services, and access to markets and capabilities. And the grants average $1.5-ish million. And it is very focused, and there's been a lot of comment of, no one can have enough money, okay? It's about $100 million a year that it's putting out in grants, but you can't have enough money. So it's very focused on being strategic and catalytic and saying we're going to work in a finite number of areas, and we're going to have a very clear strategy at the front end of what we want to catalyze and judge each grant by whether or not it gets you toward that goal, how it gets you toward that goal, and what kind of communication strategy is going to allow you to reach the other actors you need to reach to be able to leverage that up and create systemic change. So in youth, you've got to be able to communicate with the other big youth investors in the not-for-profit world and connect to governments so that ultimately the programs that work get put back into the national programming plans and things of that sort.
So Latin America has had some extraordinary success stories when it's come to economic growth and even to shrinking disparities.
Yes.
Some wonderful success stories. But let me give you a hard case.
Yeah.
Let's turn to Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's very important for the bank to be promoting small and growing businesses. What are the barriers to doing that in a place like Haiti?
So, first, the bank was in Haiti consistently since 1959, basically. And after the earthquake, we committed to a great extent with the help of the U.S. government and the rest of our shareholders, we've committed to doing $200 million per year in grants in Haiti over 11 years. So it's a total of $2.2 billion. It's the first time that a clearly articulated, sustained commitment over time in terms of grant resources has existed. And we think that's pretty critical to actually being able to achieve real outcomes. And we, amongst amongst one of the positive things, if you can say that came out of the earthquake, I think, was a different kind of cooperation amongst the donor community in Haiti. So each of the institutions defined clearly where it was going to play and where it wasn't, so that we were being much more efficient and we were quite clear. And one of our areas is private sector development, and we think that and education are the two things that are really going to be different this time in the way that we're approaching Haiti. And we have an investment fund that's focusing on lower cost capital to players that didn't typically get capital in Haiti. It's a very sort of crony capital banking system. An incubator and an accelerator that brings capability to those companies who are just starting out. Other services around the microfinance side of things and small lending side of things. So we're really looking at a different approach to private sector development in Haiti this time around, and I think that's going to address some of those concerns. And the other would be on the sovereign side, taking the doing business sort of approach, focusing on the 2, 3, or 4 things that can really make it easier to get a license, get a construction permit, and things of that sort.
So there are a couple of problems that are peculiar to Haiti, and one is the brain drain. I mean, it's way up there in terms of losing talent. And another is a need to have development on the rural side of things, in agriculture. Do you have specific approaches to those two problems?
We do, actually. Through the MIF, we have an interesting program to provide more access and finance for higher education in Haiti. We have a couple of training programs that are targeting very specific areas of the economy. High youth unemployment, so not exactly the brain drain, but critical to being able to balance the brain drain. We are working with the diaspora, and there are members of the diaspora who are coming back into Haiti because they see opportunity and because they feel it's their time to really try to help the country. On the agricultural side, a couple of things. First, land titling is a big issue around lack of productivity in agriculture, throughout the world. We are in the midst of, together in coordination with the EU, of working on land titling in Haiti. That's going to be important. Second, we have a very specific value chain approach, and the first product, the first thing you grow, commodity I guess we call it, that we've targeted is mangoes, and that's actually together with Coca-Cola. Every time you buy an Adwala Mango Tango, 10 cents of that contributes to the development of 25,000 mango growers in Haiti, increasing their productivity. We're taking that same approach, and I could go into it in detail, but I won't right now, with coffee and certain other commodities. So it's value chain by value chain, how to address historical agricultural practices, how to change some of the dynamics that exist between growers and exporters, how to improve productivity, and it's a pretty integrated and holistic way of looking at the agricultural sector.
When I saw you in Mumbai about, a couple of months ago,
yeah.
You were talking about the various stages in the development of a company, from sort of business plan to scale. As you think about those stages and you think about the tools that are available to you, in particular, investment tools, loans, grants, et cetera, what is the right sequencing? What intervention is appropriate at what point?
No, that's a great question, Jane, and I think when you look at market evolution, and ultimately all markets go through some very predictable stages. I mean, it's the S-curve of market evolution, which starts off very slow for a long period of time, followed by a period of very fast growth, which is typically 3 to 5 years, and then it plateaus out again. That's a very predictable fashion of market evolution, which has happened over and over again, and as we look at various different markets, we see that. So as we think about financing, and we think about different financial instruments, they have to be looked at in the context of this type of market evolution. And Elizabeth, during her very interesting speech, spoke about the fact that commercial capital is extraordinarily important, that there's $60 trillion of commercial capital. And when you start to look at some of the social problems that we're dealing with, particularly in India, which is of course a country of 1.2 billion people, whether it's affordable healthcare, whether it's financial inclusion, whether it's education, the reality is to be able to get to hundreds of millions of people. To get to hundreds of millions of people, there isn't enough money in this room or even this town that's going to solve those needs. We need commercial capital that's going to come from Wall Street, it's going to come from the city, it's going to come from Dalal Street in Mumbai. So ultimately, once markets start to take off and you start to need hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars of capital to really grow those markets, that's when commercial capital has to take off. And that's when we need to bring in commercial capital. So that's, I think, fairly straightforward. And again, as I said, we've seen that over and over again as markets have evolved. But when they are starting to take off, particularly when they are in the flat part of that S, there is a really interesting role for different kinds of capital providers to play. Very early on in the evolution, when you're really just experimenting in a lab or at a business school, perhaps you need grants. And I think Jacqueline will speak about that later today. There is a real role for granting as well. And we've seen with great success stories like Compartamos or SKS or M-Pesa that they've actually started off by grants that various development institutions provided. But once we move past the grants, we have a team, we start to form a business, that's when seed funding, whether it's from impact investors or seed venture capital funds, comes into play. By the way, in all of this, there is a tremendous role for philanthropic capital, whether it's to take the early risk through the seed funds or to provide grants. But at the same time, obviously, the state has a very important role to play because even as markets take off, there is the need for creation of public goods, putting in place consumer protection codes, training our workers, and so on. So there is a very important role for the state to play as well. And of course, again, it's a coordination problem because all these different stakeholders have to work together in a way that meshes very early on in this market evolution. And then once the market starts to take off, much of the risk starts to go out, business models start to scale, the margins start to appear, that's when commercial capital comes in. But it is a dance. It has to be orchestrated. And this is where, being sophisticated about understanding these different financial instruments, what role they play, what the risk expectations are, what the return expectations are, understanding all of that becomes very important.
Mm-hmm. The great advantage of sitting right next to Elizabeth, I know when there's a thought that's just popped in her mind she wants to say.
You want your pen, actually.
You want my pen? I thought you wanted a question. You probably thought it was very strange that I didn't give it. Yes, but would you like to comment?
No, now that you mention it, no, I really appreciate what you were just saying, and I think one of the challenges that we have is bringing together different types of capital. Here, we can share it.
No,
We're going to. Bringing together different types of capital at the same time. OPIC has financing instruments and insurance instruments, private equity. We don't have the ability to invest equity or to do first loss or to do grants. And what's extraordinary is in some of the most highly developmental circumstances or the most desperate circumstances like Haiti, for example, or many others, we have hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial financing we can do in different transactions that aren't done for want of $2 or $3 million in project preparation money, grant money, technical assistance to set up an implementing agent, or first loss money. So that whole idea of this effect of a leverage effect, I feel, is missing. People tend to say, well, the private market won't do it, so the public market should. Not say to themselves, well, the private market won't do it by itself, so what's the smallest amount of money I can spend to make all that happen, to get that result? So, just one example in Egypt, in fact, we've worked extremely closely with AID, where we can set up, $200-300 million loan guarantee facilities for Egyptian entrepreneurs, but we need a couple $1 million to set up the entity that's going to do it. So we have to go someplace else to get that money. So I just want to put an emphasis on aligning different types of capital together to get the outcome that we're seeking.
Jane, so that's wonderful that you said that, Elizabeth, because that's exactly what we at the Omidyar Network try to do. I think the wonderful innovation that Pam and Pierre thought through when they set up the Omidyar Network was to set up an organization that could operate both in a grant-making mode as well as in an equity investing mode, or in terms of even providing debt capital and so on. That gives us the flexibility to be able to provide the appropriate form of capital to really spark and ignite these markets. And it's like a chain reaction. If you can get it going, boom, it can take off. And I think that's really what Pierre really wonderfully understood. And that's how we are set up in this very unique structure where we can, in fact, do that. Now, one question everybody asks us is, wait a second, does that mean the same people do the grant making as do the equity investing? And the answer is yes, we do that, because it is within the context of that market system that we are operating and thinking. And so we are always asking ourselves the question, what's the right instrument to use here? And will that have the impact that we are looking for, that catalytic impact where markets can take off and we can get into the self-replicating mode?
And Julie?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, we are lucky because we do have different parts of the organization that some are grants, some are first loss guarantees, some are borrowing. But in fact, Omidyar was a partner of ours in something in Haiti, which was put in place to recapitalize more or less the microfinance institutions after the earthquake. And I will tell you, you know, we created a structure that had sort of some first loss money that was probably going to get lost, and then some different tranches. And getting people to come along with us for that bottom piece, which was the high risk, had to be looked at as a grant piece, was really difficult. And there were an awful lot of investors who, you know, you and I have had this conversation, who, you know, when you call yourself an impact investor, it's not always about the return, it's sometimes about the other kinds of impact that you're going to catalyze out the other end.
I think we'll have a lively debate. We'll probably turn to a lively debate on that. Let me just, looking at India and looking at Latin America, but one of the advantages of investing in many countries in Latin America is the soft infrastructures in place. The laws are in place. The courts are not capricious. I mean, obviously, depending on where you are.
Yeah.
That really matters. And OPIC and IDB and others condition a lot of their work on anti-corruption, you know, sort of on not having corruption. Where does this come in your grant making and investing, Jayant? Are you also making grants to organizations that try to promote transparency? I mean, how do you think about a barrier like corruption?
No, I mean, those are very, very serious problems, of course, in India and across the developing world, and there are no easy answers, unfortunately. I think part of it is we have to understand that while we would like to believe that the state is benevolent, in general, which is the view from the West, and that the state is there to provide services and to serve the citizens, a government of the people, for the people, by the people. That's actually not the historical tradition in the developing world. In India, for example, the state has always been a predatory state, an extractive state. And so if we expect the state, or if we expect state agencies to operate in a sort of very accountable, high integrity fashion, we are kidding ourselves in a way. So of course, we address it in two ways. One is obviously the work that we do in terms of, you know, market-based solutions and finding organizations to work with. We obviously do a tremendous amount of forensic analysis. We obviously do all the reference checking to understand whether the organizations we're working with are high integrity and above all of that or not. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, as you know, we are probably among the leading donors globally in government transparency and accountability. And I hope there is, by using all the wonderful technologies that are available now, it's possible to be able to create that visibility and that transparency on what government is doing so that it actually brings down corruption. And there's a site that we funded called ipaidabribe.com that's gotten a lot of press and coverage. But those are the kinds of ways in which you can actually begin to address the pervasive nature of corruption that exists in countries like India.
So Laila, let's go to Egypt for a second. You've been focused on the informal economy. So first I want to have a sense of how big the informal economy is in Egypt, how much of it is women and children, and what kinds of jobs do they have?
In Egypt, the informal economy is estimated to be between 60 to 80% of the economy. So all of the stuff we've been talking about doesn't affect them in any way. It doesn't reach them. It is largely in the urban sector, but then that involves a lot of men. In rural areas is where 50% of the informal family labor is women. Yes, there are a lot of children involved, but it's not exploitative child labor as in sweatshops. It's family-owned farmlands and businesses. And so I'm very concerned about how, when we talk about a paradigm for a social contract by any private means, we exclude these people. You see, they can't approach banks, they can't use loan guarantees, the very tight link to their land is not there, and then the infrastructure decisions in any country, whether the money comes from a multilateral bank or the government, the decisions are made by the government. And you know, we had a corrupt government, but that corrupt government was the darling of international finance institutions and bilaterals. So what, they didn't know it was corrupt? Sure they knew. So where does that leave everybody? 60 to 80%? Definitely not on the infrastructure plans of these private sector investments. So they have consultations. I personally have been part of these. They're all Mickey Mouse. And the report goes in as the communities such as the chat. One was a big oil and gas exploration. They were going to take away the fishing rights of many small fishermen, and they asked us what we thought. Of course, we told them, but then they reported it doesn't matter, we're going to give them alternative livelihoods in driving and English language. So what do you have today after the revolution? You have these fishermen now stopping and interrupting, halting the production and the extraction of that oil and gas. Major losses. So my advice is not to cut corners and to make sure that when we talk about private, we know who we mean. We know that there's corruption not just at the national level and among governments, that there are people deposed, but also among the international financial infrastructure. And we really need to look at that seriously. And at some very deep ethical questions about how we praise some models and others. So when a soft water company claims to have reduced its use of water, so therefore it's going to allow that water to be used by local communities, who's talking about the water we draw out of springs and put into fossil fuel plastic bottles and transport and use gas emissions as an alternative? I mean, we're drawing all of these resources away from purifying the rivers that the poor drink from. That debate is not even there. It's not on the map. We're applauding the private sector for doing things that are really cosmetic. Or the biofuels. We're applauding the private sector for its high R&D so that now they can produce baby diapers, hallelujah, from biofuels, from corn oil, while all of the small farmers of Brazil can go to hell and starve to death. It doesn't matter. We are not going to go to the oil fields of Iraq to pull out oil to do baby diapers. We found a better place to do it. It's in Brazil, and so on. We really, in my view, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. So I've been at this too long, so you shouldn't have invited me. And I will understand if you never invite me.
How many of you would like to borrow a pen? So you, with the help of the Gates Foundation, you entered into a study and actually a program to try to bring garbage collectors from the informal economy to the formal economy, creating syndicates, giving them the rights and the standings that workers in the formal economy have. Tell us what you learned in that process.
That sometimes you're forced into privatizing small family-owned businesses because of the political situation. These people had licenses from way back. They've been doing this for 60 years, and the government gave them licenses. Then under the mantra of global privatization and supported by the World Bank MEGA instrument, the multinationals came in and grabbed the city contracts. And these people were 120,000 overnight out on the street. So it took us a long time to learn. They didn't want to formalize. Why? They've been doing this efficiently. They had markets. They were prospering. Okay, upgrading industries, but and fighting for infrastructure and giving their votes to whichever corrupt parliamentarian was going to bring us the roads. Never mind. This is democracy where we were. But because of the onslaught of the formal private sector, the multinational that couldn't care less about shared value, they had to face this thing about having to formalize. Now, the space for it wasn't there before the revolution. It is there now. So we began with a grant from the Gates Foundation to, well, they knew they had to formalize 60 years, and first their contracts taken away, then their pigs were culled. It's a Christian minority. Then their land,
You will explain about the pigs.
If you want to.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So
we've already eaten.
Yeah, they formalized, and just 2 months ago, and it was celebrated by the liberal parliamentarians who were voted from Tahrir Squares, the young ones. They were there to support, and they're now looking at how to extend this syndicate that will include not just Cairo's garbage collectors, but all of the people who trade in materials up and down the Nile. It's a massive market, and nobody documents it or respects it even, that turns every little scrap of thing that you've left on your dinner table here, because you have health standards that say the bread has to be tossed out into the garbage, is fed to pigs, and that goes into composting plants, and that goes to, for us to grow organic food. This is what they were doing, and in 2009, because our brilliant ex-president, someone told him swine flu equals pig, you know, they looked it up in a dictionary, swine equals pig. Oh, okay, so let's kill all the pigs in Egypt, to protect the population from swine flu. It's the Mexicans that called it that. So then 350,000 pigs were culled in the most brutal manner in 3 months. So that's half our income gone, just like that. That's private business. That's private sector. Who are we talking about when we say private sector? By all private means 60 to 80% of the Egyptian private sector is informal. And it's not just Egypt. It's across the Middle East and much of the developing world. So just to see, okay, if we want to do impact investing, how are we going to work with these people? How do we get to them? They can't access OPEC banks, IDB, World Bank. No, this is all out. How do you reach them? The distance between where they are and where we imagine we're going to create returns on investment is massive. These are illiterate, stunted, no infrastructure, no education, poor, not always income poor, but agency poor. It's a huge distance. Now, who's got that long-term view and wants to do all that? And what do you want for it at the end? I don't know.
So before we get to the answer to that question, I did want you to tell us about the boys involved in recycling. And I mean, this is a program you incubated. Now I think it's called the Spirit of Youth Foundation, or association runs it. But just real quick, give us that in a nutshell.
Sure. Brand name fraud is a feature in all of the developing world for anything that's bottled or packaged in a container that has a brand name. You know, like the Louis Vuitton, Lacoste t-shirts, but this is containers. And massive losses led to the multinationals producing their product and packaging these to ask us to find a solution to this. So what we did was interrupt the cycle. It's only the rich who use these products. They throw them in their trash cans. Our garbage collectors serve high-income neighborhoods because they don't live off of a fee for service. In fact, they get nothing. They live entirely off of the recycling of the materials, organic to the pigs, non-organic to the value chain, and they've learned how to recover 80%. So we know where these go in 6 neighborhoods that surround Cairo. So they're discrete places we were able to survey, and so we said, let's interrupt it. Instead of the counterfeiters coming into our neighborhoods and buying these babies, let's set up a school where the kids whose dads lost their contracts because of the private sector, let's bring them in and teach them how to read and write and because they can't go to school, but around the containers. So they learn to read the names of the containers, count, and all of this requires capital for them to go out and buy before the counterfeiters. It also requires that the parents have a vested interest in them selling to their kids rather than to the counterfeiter who's bound to always up the price. So it has to be a community-based thing where everybody has a vested interest. And so for many years, the money for financing for this came from UNESCO, where the boys used to go out and buy, bring back to school, learn to read and write, compute, recreate, a school life. And then granulate under safety conditions, and the pelletized or granulated flakes were sold on the market, huge demand in our neighborhood, and since the boys had gotten their money up front for the containers, then the flakes were launched to the school, they paid for the teacher salaries, so it was a self-financing scheme. Then it turned out that they came on board finally after 4 years, one of the multinationals, but then there was a whole massive after the pigs, gosh, the money we lost, kids began wanting to come to school without doing the shampoo thing. And that's where we were in bad shape financially, because it was just a school, not a self-financing school, so we had to supplement with money from the Gates Foundation. So there was UNESCO, now Procter & Gamble, for a while P&G, but can you imagine what their biggest fear was, the multinationals, in supporting the buyback of their containers? They said, you know, if anybody in the north found out that the boys who go to this school are earning money from these containers, we're going to be crucified for child labor. So we said, okay, well, let's get a letter from UNESCO. Said, no, it's a communications thing. It's a propaganda thing. You can get all the letters, can go out and give every consumer. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. We live in very different worlds. Our issues are so different. There's nothing wrong with kids working if you can protect them from hazards, if you can teach them the things that, in fact, now many of the kids in our formal government school want to leave that school and come to our school. Big problem.
So I think we're going to have a lot of opportunity to talk about Egypt tonight as well. But if any of you want to sort of jump in, Jayant, I mean, the informal economy is massive in India as well. Probably the same is true in Latin America. OPIC is active. I mean, you know this region well from your days at JP Morgan, but as well as at OPIC. If anybody wants to jump
but Jane,
in
I mean,
here.
I think that is the way economic development has happened globally over the last 200, 300, 400 years, as we've seen capitalism at work, which is that folks have gotten out of the informal sector, they've gotten out of agriculture, and they've gotten into the formal sector. And we have to create the mechanisms, we have to create the infrastructure, we have to create the ways in which they can do that. For instance, in India, there is in fact a very transformational project underway, which you must have heard about, which is the Unique Identification Project that Nandan Nilekani is heading. Right now, again, correctly as Laila points out, everybody is in the informal economy. They don't even have an identity. And because they don't have an identity, they don't have an address, they don't have any way of being identified, you can't give them a bank account, you can't bring them into the formal economy, you can't give them credit, etc. But what we're doing in India right now is we're trying to enroll 1.2 billion people. What's amazing about this program is the enrollment is $2 per person. And the technology and the ecosystem has been developed whereby these 1.2 billion people can be enrolled. And once we can enroll them, we can bring them into the formal economy. And I think what we have to do as investors, as entrepreneurs, as innovators in all of this is to be able to find the kinds of businesses and the ways in which we can bring these people through creating various kinds of employment, creating the manufacturing industries and so on, so that they can in fact participate and have a chance for a better life. So that is the nature of economic development. That's how it's happened, and it is our responsibility to be able to transition folks like this over through all these kinds of mechanisms.
There's also the issue of property rights, which I think you're also working on, aren't you? The whole question of access
Absolutely,
to...
absolutely. And again, back to modern technology really being transformational in this sense, because when you look at property rights, again, once you start to digitize property rights so that you can get on a map and say this plot of land belongs to this individual and this individual can be uniquely identified, you have the opportunities to start to again bring them into the formal economy. And of course, Hernando de Soto and others have written powerfully about what it does to you if indeed you have access to that. And we know the entire Arab Spring started with this whole question of a person not being able to sell their fruit in Tunisia. So again, that had to do with property rights as well. So these are all powerful ways in which you can get people out of the informal economy and into the formal economy.
Yeah. And I'd say, like most things, there's a continuum. In Brazil, the Brazilian government is doing a really interesting program to take informal enterprises that are, I'll say, on the high end of informal and formalize them so that why do companies stay informal? Companies stay informal. These are small, enterprises. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to be subject to employment rules. They don't want to have a lot of the structure around them. And you have to convince them that the cost of that, with lack of access to finance, lack of access to other kinds of tools, is a bad trade. So this is a program that literally in the last year has formalized hundreds of thousands of companies by providing a package of incentives that include credit cards and debit cards and phone cards and training and very light regulation in terms of tax and social things to formalize. Now, the proof will be in the pudding to see if they stay formalized and if they grow past the ceilings that begin to take away some of those incentives. And on the other side, much as you were describing, we have in every country in the developing world, I think there's waste picker issues, right? And so we actually do work with very informal populations in the MIF and in the bank through OMJ and others, and working with companies now who I think have evolved to the point where they realize that these are issues that they need to engage in with multinationals to say, how can we help in the waste pickers to improve people's lives, move them out of the dumps, yet maintain their ability to recycle the waste, take the middlemen out so that they receive a greater proportion of the value of that value chain. Mm-hmm. And how do we then, so we get their kids in school, so we get different kinds of enterprises now working with municipalities and making them somewhat more formal. So there's a big continuum when you talk about informality.
Yeah, I'd like to just respond to something that Laila said a moment ago. And that is that, I totally appreciate what you say about the sometimes rapacious and irresponsible private sector. And that being said, I don't think anyone's saying that the private sector or business naturally gravitates automatically to being a force for good. I don't think anyone's saying that. I think what I think we're trying to say is that they're some of the biggest problems we have in the world, whether it's agriculture, productivity not being sufficient to feed the planet, whether it's climate change, whether it's rural electrification, these things aren't problems that we're going to be able to solve without the private sector. So for me, this session is really about figuring out what are the mechanisms that we can use to harness the resources and the know-how of the private sector to address some of the challenges that we have, whether they be in the formal sector or the informal sector.
And capture some of the ingenuity of the citizen sector.
Absolutely.
Right?
That's right.
That's the key. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions, so I don't want to miss that. So let's make sure the folks with microphones are there. And here we've got some questions right over here.
Hi, my name is Emily West. I'm with the West Foundation. First of all, thank you to Jane for putting together a panel that I think really encompassed both sides of this issue, because that was not really what I was expecting today. And thank you to all the...
never what anyone's expecting.
Well, I don't mean that against the GPF, which always does a great job, but in essence, I think going to a lot of conferences and gatherings of thought leaders, et cetera, we find often that right now impact investment, for example, has become the microcredit push of the 21st century, and sometimes that's all the side we hear of it is impact investment, as if it were a magic bullet for all cures. And I think definitely we've heard two sides of that question today, and also from what Elizabeth was just saying, that no, the people in impact investing don't anticipate that it is a be-all, cure-all for everything. To actually ask a question, the question I had then was specifically for Elizabeth and Julie, because you touched on this the most. What do you see as the areas that impact investment can affect the most, and which part do you see the private investing affecting, and which parts do you see the public sector affecting? Where do you draw that line of delineation?
And since Julie raised the point about what kind of ROI you should expect, you might touch on that as well. Elizabeth, do you want to start this, or?
Julie, you want to
Oh,
go?
you go.
No, really.
Oh, you.
So your question about which sectors we see impact investing having the most traction, if you will. You know, OPIC did a call for funds, a request for proposal for impact investing funds about about 6 months ago, and we were gobsmacked to have, I think, 151 expressions of interest, and a full 88 of them actually filled in the application forms. And we were amazed to see, just coming specifically to your question, within those 88 applicants, every possible sector you can imagine, whether it was off-grid solar, microfinance, waste management, irrigation, agriculture, very little in the manufacturing, obviously. So we saw all kinds of ranges of this stuff. We saw all kinds of different applicants as well. Structures, equity funds, debt funds, fund of funds. And one of the interesting things about this was that every single one of those 88 funds did have a very explicit plan to measure both their social and their financial returns. So the metrics were in place for each one of these funds. But we did see, healthcare as well. So I think all of these sectors are sectors in which there is a way to have a positive financial return and a positive economic and social benefit as well. Now, sometimes getting there is going to either take a long time, or it's going to require some grant money up front, it's going to require some equity as well as some debt, it's going to require different instruments. But in every single one of those sectors that I mentioned, it is possible to have both a financial and a social return.
Before returning to Julie, Jayant, you've been active in the health sector. Where's the promising opportunities been for you in India?
Well, just speaking specifically about India, I can tell you that right now we've been very active, for example, in education, because affordable private schools and as well as improving the quality of education in government schools has seen a tremendous spurt of entrepreneurial innovation. So in education, for instance, I think it's very possible to generate, of course, good financial returns and terrific social returns. And that's not even speaking about the longer term positive externality of providing people with good education. So I think that's a great sector, education, for instance.
Julie, did you want to take a swipe at
I
this?
agree with both things that were said. I don't think there's almost a sector that you can come up with where you can't and where we haven't seen or where you can't see an impact investment opportunity. And we are about to approve something in the education sector in Peru that is terrific, and that I think is, you look at the success of development policies and the number of people who are emerging into the middle class. The education offering from government is woefully inadequate across the board, and the private sector, I think, is going to be a big part of that answer, and we're seeing a lot of opportunity there.
So Jane, let me add something to that, which is, I think you're both exactly right, which is that there are opportunities for impact in all these different sectors. The one thing that we do take a very long and hard look at when we fund either through equity or through grant various organizations is the price point at which these products and services are delivered. So if the price point is sufficiently low, we know it's going to go to the base of the pyramid. And then we want to understand, is the business model such that it can generate sufficient margin and sufficient return on investment that you can meet these affordable price points. So one of the things is you all think about impact investing and you think about finding these opportunities. A very powerful but a very important way of understanding whether it's going to have social return is to look at the price point. Is it genuinely affordable? And again, the way we look at it is to say, is it affordable enough so that somebody who only has a bicycle is going to be able to afford it on a monthly basis? So, there's simple tests that you can use, but once you are in that sweet spot where the prices are low and, it's available to the mass market, you're going to generate social return provided you're in certain sectors.
So I'm going to, we're only going to have time for two questions. I'd like you to give them to us back to back, and the microphone is coming there. And let me just note, and then get to Adele over here, let me just note that Omidyar is also doing grant support for Teach for India. So it's interesting that you've got both sides of your portfolio working this problem.
Hi, thanks for a great discussion. I'm Kara Hurst with BSR. We work with several hundred corporations around the world. My question is around, we work with corporations looking at how they can be more transparent and accountable for the externalities that are produced through, their production of goods and services. But what about the pricing of ecosystem services? Where is that conversation going to take place in order for corporations to be able to appropriately price in and value ecosystem services in those markets and the value that they're now obtaining?
Great.
So if you
and
could expand on that.
Let's get Adele's question. And we do have a panel on the pricing of ecosystem services. So
this isn't necessarily a question, but the work that we've heard today on impact investing is fabulous. I want to pick up on something that Liesl said this morning, which was the philanthropic piece that created the environment for it. But I think as we really celebrate and recognize and expand impact investing, we need to understand that the environment in which that can succeed, human rights, good governance, etc., depends a great deal on philanthropy to create the opportunities that all of you were talking about. So that's
good. And John Harvey had his hand up. There he is, but he's not next to a microphone. Okay.
No, I am. So, Elizabeth, I appreciate you're talking about externalized costs, because I think that's really a dirty secret about our economy. And I read one where that for every pound of waste that will leave us today, 100 pounds of waste were generated to get these products here. Staggering. I don't know if that's true or not. In any event, I'm wondering what your specific advice is for philanthropy, impact investors, anyone who want to get at that issue of externalized costs and how we really begin to internalize them. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay. 2 questions and a comment. Who'd like to start?
You're right, it is a dirty word. Externalized cost is actually a metaphor for the exploitative cost of local communities' livelihoods, whether it's the water they drink or the land that they farm or whatever. There are a number of environmental groups in this country, amazing people in Berkeley, of course, who are looking at these things. And an answer to the person who asked about where's that conversation happening, I'm only aware of it happening among that group of people at Berkeley, the whole place. But it brings me back to my theme that we're not calling a spade a spade. We've got to stop calling them externalized costs. They're not. They are human lives, conditions of work, no social safety and security, and and call a spade as we invest, not as global philanthropists, as private sector people. We should tell the world the truth. If we claim that we want a new social contract, and after you name it, say what the cost is, and stop doing it when it turns out that it is not building a human life, because your primary purpose on the planet as a private sector entrepreneur should be to build a human life, not to make money in the bank. If you build a life, you will make money. Right now we're looking at it in two separate islands. The UN MDGs are saying, let's count all the kids who died and the mothers who died, and give the bilan, the survey, the results of this. And the World Bank and the others are saying, let's look at how GDP, as if it has nothing to do with that. So you have countries with high GDP but terrible human.
We're going to talk more about that tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
So.
And these two are not talking. So let's change our metrics after we call a spade and say, before I invest, I want to know how equitable is the growth in that country. I want to know about transparency. I want to know about all of the child mortality figures. And that's a good country where I can invest in keeping kids from dying, not in making money, and never mind what happens to them, because you know what.
So let me move to make sure everybody else gets a chance before we stop. External costs.
So I think that there are two perils that have been mentioned in the course of these questions. One is the peril of underestimating the external costs. And there, I'm actually optimistic, again, that there's underway a number of very interesting mechanisms to really measure more accurately what those costs are, whether it be sustainability labels on products, whether it be different industries like the apparel industry that's gotten together to agree on what constitutes a sustainable process. And so I think the metrics around that will evolve over time. And so I think we're headed in the right direction. Measuring ecosystem services is clearly one of the most exciting in that area. And I would just shout out, I think Michael Jenkins is here someplace. He should be a great person to listen to on the panel later on. So that's the perils of underestimating the costs, which I do think we're making progress on in terms of metrics. I think there's another peril, which is overestimating the impact. And I get very nervous, maybe it's because I spent 20 years in microfinance, that the hype and the over-promising is one of the most dangerous things we can do to a sector like impact investing. I get, you have in many cases, you have the breathless maximizers on the one hand saying this is going to be the big silver bullet that's going to change the world and it's going to be $1 trillion market. And I think that's dangerous. And then you have this sort of derisive minimizers that think this is a piece, this is nothing, it's going to be irrelevant. And both of them are talking about the impact investment in relation to the global financial markets of $70 trillion. That's totally not the relevant benchmark. The relevant benchmark is to compare what impact investing could be, the investments that can have both financial and social returns, not in relation to the financial markets, but in relation to today's aid budgets. If you look at today's global aid budget of $50 billion or whatever, it is easy we can find a way for the private market to make impact investments that far exceed that. So I come back to the fact that the power of the impact investing world is every dollar that we can get the private market to invest in something that's good for the planet is $1 saved for government budgets to spend on truly intractable problems.
And those investments have to be responsive to the communities. They have to be responsive to the consumer, back to your earlier point. Please join me in thanking Elizabeth, Julie, Jayant, and Laila.
Thank you all.